My Jewish name is actually Hadassah, which means myrtle, but I believe you may have heard of me under my Persian name Esther, which actually means star. By God's amazing grace, I was allowed to rise to the position of Queen of the Persian Empire when I married my husband, King Xerxes. How did I come to be in Persia? You see, I am a descendant of the Jewish exiles that were taken by force from the land of Judah by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in his second attack on Jerusalem in 597 BC. My parents died early in my life, and I was raised by my cousin Mordecai. Mordecai's great-great-grandfather Kish, who was a Benjamite, was taken in the second deportation of exiles, along with Ezekiel, his wife Elena, and many others, and were settled in the country of Babylon along the Shabar River in 597 BC. After that, many things happened to our people. Back in Judah, 11 years later, King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came up against Jerusalem for the third and final time, burning and destroying the city and the temple. Judah, as a nation, was gone. Jeremiah had written to the Jewish remnant living in Babylon, telling our people to settle in, plant gardens, build homes. We would serve the land of Babylon for a total of 70 years. The Babylonian rule lasted until 539 BC. King Cyrus of Persia invaded the ruling city of Babylon and took the city by surprise without a fight. After that, under the newly united Medes and Persians, a group of our people were allowed to return home to Judah along with Joshua and Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple of Yahweh. The Edict of Cyrus, as it was called, was decreed exactly 70 years after the time that Babylon first attacked Jerusalem. Cyrus was the first king of the Medo-Persian Empire. My husband Xerxes was the fifth emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire. He was an impulsive man, but a good one. I would love to tell you how I became queen, but I have not been asked to tell my own story, but the story of another Jewish descendant who rose to power in both the Babylonian and Persian empires. His name was Daniel. Often Mordecai and I would pore over the copies of the scrolls of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel and discuss their meetings. You see, Daniel was a famous dignitary in the government of Persia, but I am ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning. Let's go back to the land of Judah, back to Jerusalem, to 605 BC. Daniel was a young prince of Judah living in the city of Jerusalem along with three of his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. All of the young men were upper-class nobles who were well educated and in the process of being trained to serve in the government of Judah, which was currently in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim. Spiritually, the kingdom of Judah was in idolatry and decline. Politically, the country was on its last legs. Through many of the prophets, Yahweh had foretold of judgment upon Judah and Jerusalem. Seemingly overnight, things went from bad to worse. General Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came up against Jerusalem and besieged it. In his first attack, he put the city under tribute to Babylon. As a bonus, he took many of the gold and silver artifacts from Yahweh's temple, and also the young nobles, young men he could train up to serve in the Babylonian Empire back home. Daniel and his friends were deported in the year 605 BC and put under the authority of the head eunuch in Babylon for 3 years of training. All of the young Jewish men were stars, good-looking, intelligent, and wise. But more importantly, they were dedicated to Yahweh. And Daniel loved Yahweh most of all. Now the boys were given rich food and wine to drink, but the food given to them violated their dietary regulations for God's people that were outlined in the Torah. But what were they to do? Bold Daniel requested that the 4 of them were only given vegetables to eat. Can you imagine that? How strong their faith must have been. But God granted them favor from the chief of the eunuchs. What a miracle of Yahweh. And they were allowed an experiment. They could eat vegetables and drink water for 10 days, and then he would examine their appearance. At the end of the testing period, upon examination, the Jewish nobles appeared stronger and healthier than the other young men being trained. They won. They were able to keep their special diet. After 3 years, they were all brought before Nebuchadnezzar, who had now advanced to the position of king. Yahweh had done another miracle. He had given them knowledge, skill in literature, and wisdom. Also, Daniel had been given the gift of understanding visions and dreams. After interviewing them, the king himself decided that none of the other young men could compare to those 4. In the matters of wisdom and understanding, they were 10 times better than the astrologers and magicians in the realm. So they were chosen to serve before the king. Night, about a year later, King Nebuchadnezzar had a disturbing dream, so disturbing he could not sleep.
He called for all the wise men in his realm, demanding that they not only give interpretation of the dream, but the contents of the dream itself. He was so insistent that he declared that if they could not do as he requested, he would cut them to pieces and burn their homes. However, if he could reveal the dream and its meaning, they would receive gift and honor. I can imagine this sent the wise men into a panic. No one really knows why he was so harsh in this manner, but many speculate since he was a young king, he was trying to eliminate his father's top advisors who may be unloyal. But Mordecai and I believe it was Yahweh's plan. When the king was reminded that what he had asked the wise men to do was humanly impossible, he became angry and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon, including our 4 young Jewish heroes. But Daniel and his friends came to the rescue. How? First, he asked the captain of the guard who arrested him, "What's going on? Why is the decree so urgent?" Wisely, Daniel went into the king and asked for time to pray. After having his request granted, he went to his house and he shared the prayer request with his friends. That night, after they prayed, Yahweh revealed the secret of the dream to Daniel in a vision. Daniel immediately began to praise and thank God. What an amazing rescue! Just like Joseph had done so long ago, Daniel went to the king with the news, being careful to give credit to Yahweh for revealing the contents of the dream and the interpretation. Daniel went on to say, "The dream that was revealed was for latter days. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. The image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet were partly of iron and baked clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them to pieces. Then the entire statue was crushed and mixed together. The wind blew all the pieces away, so no trace of them was found. And then the stone that struck the feet became a great mountain and filled the entire earth." This was the dream. Now we will tell in the interpretation before the king, Daniel declared. He went on to tell the king that Yahweh was revealing to Nebuchadnezzar what was coming in the future. The head of gold represented himself. The God of heaven had given the king of Babylon a kingdom of power, strength, and glory. And after him another kingdom of silver would arise, but would be inferior. And then another of bronze would rule over all the earth. And looking back, we know these kingdoms represent the Persian kingdom, of which I was queen, and also the Greeks. And after that, there would be an iron kingdom, the Romans. The kingdom would be strong as iron, and the kingdom would break in pieces and crush all the others. And in later years, the kingdom would be divided. And just like the feet were a mixture of iron and clay, so too the kingdom will be partly strong and fragile. It will always be divided. And in the days of these last kings, God will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And it will consume the other parts of the statue, consuming the other kingdoms, and stand forever. We know it to be the kingdom of the Messiah. At this, King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face before Daniel and declared that truly Daniel's God was the God of gods. And the king honored Daniel and gave him many gifts and promoted him to rule over the whole province of Babylon and also be chief administrator of the wise men. The king even gave promotions to his 3 friends too. But Daniel had risen to celebrity status. I guess this must have all gone to Nebuchadnezzar's head because he decided to build a gold statue. And since the statue was made of gold, my guess is the huge idol probably looked like him. The statue was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Can you imagine the amount of gold it took to build? What a sight! It was set up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon, and as soon as it was finished, the king sent out invitations to all his officials to attend the dedication of the statue. It was a beautiful day, and the statue was stunning. All the men gathered before the statue and the king. Then a herald announced that the symphony was going to play music, and at a given moment, everyone was requested to bow down to the golden image. Whoever would not bow down would be thrown into the fiery furnace. The music played to a crescendo, and at its height, the people fell down and worshipped the image. At the next moment, some of the Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews of misconduct. They told the king that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's friends, who were now known by their Persian names, refused to pay regard to the king. They would not bow down to the image the king had set up, and the king became angry. Being knowledgeable with the court intrigues myself, I am wondering how the Chaldean wise men had become so jealous of the success of Daniel and his friends. Was he angry at the Chaldeans for tattling, or with the Jewish men for refusing to bow? Whatever the case, he gave them one more chance to change their minds, but they would not. They were convinced Yahweh would save them. But even if he did not, they said they would not bow to the image. At this news, the king became truly furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He told the guards to heat the furnace 7 times hotter. Well, I assure you've heard this story. Mighty men of valor from the army were called to them. They bound them tightly and threw them into the furnace, and the fire was so hot that the guards themselves were killed as they carried out their orders. After a time, the king, becoming curious of their fate, looked into the furnace. Behold, the men were walking unbound in the furnace. Not only that, there was a fourth man, who the king called Bar Elohim, or the Son of God. Yeshua, Jesus, was walking there with them. When the king called the men to come out, they walked out unaffected. Their hair was not singed, nor their bodies burned. Even their clothes were unaltered, and they did not smell of smoke in the least. The king was so overwhelmed with this miracle that he made a decree: no one could speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and anyone who tried to mess with their worship of him would be cut to pieces. And then he added, because there is no other God that can deliver like this, the 3 miracle men were promoted in the kingdom. As Mordecai told me this story many times when I was a little girl, I later was sure this message was for me, to give me strength in my days to go before the king to plead for my people when it seemed all hope was lost. Yeshua was with me in the fiery furnace too. He promised never to leave us or forsake us, his people, and he walks with you in your trials as well. You may ask, where was Daniel through all of this? No one knows. I suspect that he was out of the province on some faraway mission for the king. However, the plot formed by the enemies of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thwarted, and what was meant for evil God used for good. The next event in Daniel's life is actually written on a scroll by King Nebuchadnezzar himself. It was written as an edict, which would meant it would have gone all over the empire in 562 BC. The king was sitting at rest in his palace when he had another dream that troubled him, and as he had done before, he called the wise men of Babylon to interpret the dream. At least this time he told them the dream, but none of them could do it. Finally, Daniel entered, and by this time Daniel was referred to as the master of the magicians. But when he heard the dream, he certainly did not wish to be the one to tell the king the news. He gingerly went on to tell the dream and interpretation, which was strange indeed. It was of a great tree, the king himself, who was growing tall and prospering, bearing fruit and providing a home for many animals. However, an angel, which was called a watcher, came from heaven and cut down the tree, or the king, shaking its leaves and scattering its fruit. Only a stump of its root was left. The interpretation: the king would be changed into a beast and will live that way for 7 years, tied to a tree and living in the grass of the field. Daniel relayed that Yahweh wished to humble Nebuchadnezzar, reminding him that he was the one who had given him his kingdom. He would remain that way until he knew the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. His kingdom would be restored to him after he knew that heaven rules. Daniel advised the king that a humble attitude might change his future. He encouraged him: be righteous, show mercy to the poor. The dream may possibly be a warning. 1 year went by and the king forgot about the dream. I am not sure just what was going through his mind, but the dream, which had been a warning, suddenly became true. Do you know what the king said in his pride? He said this: "Is this not great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and the honor of my majesty?" And while these words were still in his mouth, God reminded him of the dream. Within an hour, the king had been transformed into a beast. His hair grew like feathers, and his nail became as birds' claws, and he ate grass as oxen and was hidden from men. It is said that Daniel himself took care of the king during that time, but no one knows for sure. However, just as Yahweh had foretold, the king lifted up his eyes to heaven after 7 years and blessed the Lord of heaven, and he finally praised Yahweh, who lives forever. After this experience with God, Nebuchadnezzar was never the same. He had learned his lesson. He testified of God's glory and power, his ways of truth, and ability to discipline the proud. He was completely restored back to his right mind and body and reinstated as monarch over the kingdom for 1 more year. At his death, his son, Evil-Merodach, what a name, became king in 562 BC. During the lifetime of King Nebuchadnezzar, much happened to my people, Israel. The captives who'd been taken by the king during the 3 sieges of Jerusalem were settled into life in Babylon now. Mordecai's great-great-grandfather, Kish, and Ezekiel the prophet, along with a group of exiles living in the Shebar River, were hanging on to hope, as were other pockets of Jewish people settled in other places across the realm. Our people had been told by the prophet Jeremiah in a letter that we would be in Babylon for 70 years. They were not surprised when Jerusalem fell in 586 BC. The country was gone, but the captives had hope. This hope would be realized 24 years after the death of King Nebuchadnezzar. shortly after the Persians defeated Babylon. But what would become of Daniel? Be sure to come back for part 2.